Speaking of school lunches, there is one particular dish that defines our generation more than any other. It was deep-fried whale meat, marinated in a strong mixture of ginger and soy sauce. Today, it is extremely rare, but back then, it was the absolute cheapest meat available to feed a growing population. The pieces were dark, almost black, and had a very dense, chewy texture. It had a slightly metallic, gamey flavor, but the sweet and salty crust made it incredibly delicious to a hungry child. We chewed on those tough pieces of meat for a long time, savoring every bit of the savory juices. The government pushed it heavily because it was rich in protein, making it the undeniable star of the lunch menu. Whenever the smell of ginger and frying oil drifted from the school kitchen down the hallways, a wave of excitement would ripple through the classroom. That specific taste is locked away in time. It is a flavor that belongs entirely to the children of the Showa era, reminding us of our collective resilience and shared history. Please, close your eyes for just a moment. Try to remember a specific sound from your childhood. Perhaps it is the distant, melancholic chant of the sweet potato vendor echoing through the twilight. Or maybe it is the scent of sweet soy sauce bubbling on an iron griddle at a small neighborhood stall. Welcome back to a time when life was much simpler. Today, we are going to talk about the foods we ate in Japan during the 1960s and 1970s when we had absolutely no money. These were not fancy meals. They were born out of strict necessity and empty wallets. Yet, looking back, they taste better in our memories than any expensive restaurant meal today. By the end of our journey together, I will remind you of a specific, humble dish that I believe represents the absolute pure essence of a mother's love. It is a memory that might just bring a gentle tear to your eye. Before we explore our pantries of the past, let us remember how the world felt back then. Time flowed much slower in the Showa era. There was no internet to rush our minds, and no mobile phones to distract us from the people sitting right in front of us. When you waited for rice to cook in the heavy iron pot, you truly experienced the waiting. You watched the steam rise. You felt the chill of the wooden house in the winter. People often look back and think that because we had less money and less technology, our lives were somehow poorer. But you and I know the absolute truth. Our lives were infinitely richer in emotion, in connection, and in sincerity. Neighbors shared their humble vegetables over the fence. Families huddled closely together under the kotatsu table to share body heat and a single tangerine. We appreciated every single grain of rice because we knew the hard work it took to bring it to our table. The lack of money forced us to be creative. It forced us to be deeply grateful. Let us now walk down memory lane and taste the beautiful, frugal past once again. Let us begin with the simplest of mornings. Before the sun fully rose, the wooden houses of our childhood were bitterly cold. The only warmth came from the kitchen. There was no money for lavish breakfasts, but we had the humble raw egg on rice. You will take a bowl of freshly cooked, steaming white rice and crack a single egg directly into the center. The yolk was a deep, vibrant orange, sitting perfectly on the snowy mountain of grains. Then came the dark, salty soy sauce, poured just enough to stain the egg. The ritual was in the mixing. You will take your wooden chopsticks and beat the mixture vigorously until it became a pale, golden, frothy cloud. The sound of the chopsticks rapidly clinking against the porcelain bowl is a rhythm burned into my memory. We would eat it quickly, slurping the rich, savory mixture before running off to school. It was incredibly cheap, and it was born out of pure necessity. But that warm bowl felt like an absolute feast that fueled our growing bodies for the long day ahead. It is a taste of morning comfort that no modern cereal can ever replace. Next, let us recall a dish that sounds almost comedic today, but was a staple of our frugal childhoods. We simply called it cat rice. It was nothing more than a bowl of hot rice, topped with a handful of dried bonito flakes and a generous splash of soy sauce. When you sprinkled the delicate, paper-thin shavings of fish over the steaming rice, the heat made them curl and dance as if they were alive. I remember staring at them, absolutely mesmerized by the magical movement. The aroma was incredibly comforting. It was a deep, oceanic scent, mixed with the roasted earthiness of the soy sauce. It was called cat food because it resembled the scraps thrown to neighborhood strays. But to us, it was a profound delicacy. In an era where wasting even a single grain of rice was considered a sin, this simple topping transformed leftovers into a deeply satisfying meal. It taught us to appreciate the absolute core flavors of our culture. We did not need rich sauces or expensive cuts of meat to feel full and happy. The warmth of the heavy bowl in our cold hands was always more than enough. Do you remember the melancholic song of the stone-roasted sweet potato truck in late autumn? When the wind grew biting and cold, that lingering voice calling out from the slow-moving vehicle was like a siren song for children. We would scrape together our small allowances, holding the heavy copper coins tightly in our hands. The vendor would wrap the hot purple potato in old crinkled newspaper. The heat would seep through the paper, instantly warming our freezing fingers. When you finally split the sweet potato open, a thick plume of golden steam would rise into the crisp evening air. The flesh inside was incredibly soft, glowing like a bright yellow jewel, and entirely caramelized at the edges. It was naturally sweet, almost like a rich pastry, but it came straight from the earth. We would often share one potato between siblings, carefully breaking it in half so the portions were perfectly equal. Eating that piping hot sweet potato while standing under the darkening sky is a feeling of pure, unadulterated comfort that belonged entirely to our youth. Let us think about the late nights when fathers came home from very long shifts. The house would be quiet, save for the rhythmic ticking of the wall clock. The dinner was long over, and the leftover rice had turned hard and cold in the wooden tub. This is when the magic of poured green tea over rice came to life. It was the ultimate fast food of the Showa era. You would place a mound of cold rice in a bowl, maybe top it with a tiny piece of salted salmon skin or a single pickled plum, and then pour scalding hot green tea right over it. The hard rice would instantly soften, releasing a sweet starch into the bitter tea. The sound of slopping this dish in the quiet hours of the night was deeply soothing. It was a testament to the frugal housewife who ensured that nothing was ever thrown away. The hot tea warmed the stomach and calmed the mind before sleep. Even today, when we feel unwell or deeply nostalgic, a simple bowl of tea poured over rice brings back the quiet safety of those late nights in our childhood homes. Real meat was a rare luxury for most ordinary families back then. Beef and pork were reserved for very special occasions. Instead, we relied heavily on fish sausages. Do you remember them? They came wrapped in a bright, almost unnatural orange plastic casing, tightly sealed at the ends with small aluminum clips. We would often use our teeth to carefully bite off the metal clip and peel back the plastic. Mothers would slice the soft, slightly rubbery sausage into thin rounds and fry them in a pan with a little bit of cheap oil. When they hit the heat, the edges would curl up slightly and turn a beautiful crispy brown. The smell of frying fish sausage filled the small kitchen, trickling into the living room and making our mouths water. They were packed into our aluminum lunchboxes next to white rice, providing a much-needed source of protein. It was an imitation of Western meat, but it developed its own unique, savory identity. Even now, the bright orange color of that plastic wrapper instantly transports me back to the small, bustling kitchen of my mother. School lunches in the 1960s and 70s were an unforgettable experience. At the center of almost every meal was a very specific type of bread. It was shaped like a small rugby ball and had a distinctly dry, slightly chewy texture. We called it kopapan. The bread itself had very little flavor, but it was the canvas for our childhood joy. We were often given a tiny, square plastic packet of deeply artificial strawberry jam or rich yellow margarine. We would carefully tear the bread down the middle, creating a pocket, and squeeze the sweet contents inside. The contrast between the dry, floury outside and the sweet, sticky inside was wonderful. I can still smell the unique combination of floor wax, dusty chalk, and sweet bread that completely filled the wooden school buildings. Eating together with our classmates, trading our jam packets, and laughing over the small wooden desks created a powerful bond. That dry, simple bread nourished an entire generation of children as our country was slowly rebuilding itself from the ground up. Speaking of school lunches, there is one particular dish that defines our generation more than any other. It was deep-fried whale meat, marinated in a strong mixture of ginger and soy sauce. Today, it is extremely rare, but back then, it was the absolute cheapest meat available to feed a growing population. The pieces were dark, almost black, and had a very dense, chewy texture. It had a slightly metallic, gamey flavor, but the sweet and salty crust made it incredibly delicious to a hungry child. We chewed on those tough pieces of meat for a long time, savoring every bit of the savory juices. The government pushed it heavily because it was rich in protein, making it the undeniable star of the lunch menu. Whenever the smell of ginger and frying oil drifted from the school kitchen down the hallways, a wave of excitement would ripple through the classroom. That specific taste is locked away in time. It is a flavor that belongs entirely to the children of the Showa era, reminding us of our collective resilience and shared history. After school, our world revolved around the local penny candy store. It was usually a small, dimly lit shop run by an incredibly old grandmother with a kind, wrinkled face. The air inside smelled of sweet dust, cheap chocolate, and soy sauce. Our absolute favorite treat was a stick of dried wheat gluten, entirely coated in thick, dark brown sugar. It was surprisingly large, looking like a dark brown log, but it was as light as a feather. When you bit into it, the crisp, sugary exterior would shatter, melting instantly on your tongue, while the inside was dry and cotton-like. It cost only a few small coins, but it felt like a massive treasure. Our fingers and lips would be completely stained brown by the sticky sugar. We would sit on the concrete steps outside the shop, comparing our purchases and sharing our sweets as the sun slowly set. That cheap, sugary stick represents the ultimate freedom of our youth, a time when a pocket full of low-value coins made us feel like the richest children in the entire world. We must also remember the absolute miracle of the very first instant ramen. When it first appeared, it felt like magic. It was a hard, square block of dried noodles, pre-seasoned with a savory chicken flavor, and it had a small depression in the middle, specifically designed to hold a raw egg. You did not need a stove to cook it. You simply placed the block in a large ceramic bowl, cracked an egg into the center, and poured boiling hot water carefully over the top. Then, you covered the bowl with a heavy plate to trap the steam. The 3-minute wait felt like absolute torture for a hungry child. We would stare at the clock, watching the second hand slowly tick away. When you finally lifted the plate, a massive cloud of salty, chicken-scented steam would hit your face. The egg would be perfectly soft-boiled by the residual heat. Slurping those curly, flavorful noodles on a rainy afternoon while listening to the raindrops hit the tin roof is a profound memory of warmth and total satisfaction that we will never, ever forget. There is incredible beauty in absolute simplicity. Nothing proves this more than the traditional flag of Japan lunchbox. Our mothers would pack our rectangular aluminum tins with tightly pressed pure white rice. Right in the very center, she would press a single, intensely sour, bright red pickled plum. Visually, it was a perfect replica of our national flag. There were no side dishes, no colorful vegetables, and certainly no expensive meat. It was the ultimate symbol of a tight budget. Yet, the intense, mouth-puckering sourness and saltiness of that single plum was strong enough to flavor the entire tin of rice. The sour plum actually made the plain white rice taste incredibly sweet by contrast. I can still hear the metallic scraping sound of aluminum chopsticks hitting the bottom of the tin as we tried to gather every last grain of rice. It taught us to find deep satisfaction in the bare minimum. We ate it with immense pride and gratitude, knowing that our mothers woke up before dawn just to prepare it for us. In many households during those times, eating pure, unmixed white rice was a rare luxury. To make the expensive rice stretch further to feed a large family, our mothers would mix it with barley. You could always spot the barley by the distinct, dark brown line running down the center of each plump grain. It gave the rice a slightly brown tint and a very distinct, chewy, bouncy texture. At the time, as children, we often complained. We deeply envied the families who could afford bowls of pure, glowing white rice. Barley was considered the food of the poor. We would sit around the low wooden table, chewing the hearty grains, secretly wishing for a richer meal. But looking back with older eyes, we realized that this cheap filler was incredibly healthy and nutritious. The earthy, nutty flavor of the barley rice, paired with a simple bowl of homemade miso soup, is now a taste that many of us actually crave. It reminds us of a time when survival meant being clever, and family dinners were about being together, no matter what was in the bowl. When we craved something savory and rich after school, we turned to the cheap, primitive version of okonomiyaki. We called it the 1 yen Western meal. It was sold at tiny street stalls, where a vendor stood behind a massive, hissing iron griddle. The batter was nothing more than cheap wheat flour dissolved in water. The vendor would pour a thin circle of the watery batter onto the hot iron, sprinkle a few chopped green onions on top, and maybe add a tiny sprinkle of dried shrimp if we were lucky. But the real magic was the sauce. They would take a thick brush and paint the cooked pancake with a dark, intensely sweet and savory brown sauce. The smell of that sauce hitting the scorching hot iron plate created a cloud of fragrant smoke that could pull you in from 3 streets away. We would eat it while it was still burning hot, folded over in a piece of brown paper, blowing frantically to cool our tongues. It was a brilliant illusion of a rich, complex meal, created from the absolute cheapest ingredients imaginable. Fruit was generally quite expensive, but there was one sweet treat we cherished deeply. It was the heavy tin can of mandarin oranges preserved in thick, sugary syrup. These cans were often kept hidden away in the back of the cupboard. They were strictly reserved for very special occasions, or more commonly, for when a child caught a fever. Being sick was miserable, but the promise of those cold, slippery orange segments made it slightly bearable. I remember the loud, metallic crunch of the heavy can opener piercing the top of the tin. We would watch carefully as Mother divided the perfect, vibrant orange pieces evenly into small glass bowls. The fruit was soft and incredibly sweet, but the best part was always the leftover liquid. We would fight with our siblings over who got to tilt the bowl and drink the remaining thick syrup at the bottom. In the dimly lit rooms of our childhood, the bright, glowing color of those canned oranges felt like a tiny ray of sunshine captured just for us to enjoy in our moments of weakness. Let us take a slow walk home from the elementary school. The late afternoon shadows were growing long on the dusty streets. We would always pass by the local neighborhood butcher shop. From the open storefront poured the incredibly rich scent of hot frying oil and rendered beef fat. For just a few small coins, you could buy a freshly fried potato croquette. The butcher would hand it to you, wrapped in a small square of white oil-absorbing paper. The grease would immediately begin to soak through, making the paper translucent. The outside was coated in coarse breadcrumbs, fried to a perfect, shattering golden brown crunch. But when you bit into it, the inside was a cloud of fluffy, steaming hot mashed potato. It was slightly sweet, with maybe a tiny fleck of minced onion or stray meat to give it flavor. We would eat it while walking, savoring the contrast between the crispy shell and the soft, burning hot interior as twilight settled over the quiet neighborhood. It was the ultimate, cheap, savory comfort. Snacks in the house were rare, but mothers had a clever way of providing for us. Perfect whole rice crackers were expensive and meant for giving as gifts to guests. But at the local market, you could buy massive, clear plastic bags filled entirely with broken, rejected crackers from the factory. We called them shattered rice crackers. Because they were broken during the baking process, they were sold for a fraction of the normal price. In fact, they were actually much better than the perfect ones. The dark, savory soy sauce glaze would seep deeply into the rough, cracked edges, making the broken pieces intensely flavorful and salty. Our family would sit on the worn tatami mats in the living room, watching the small, flickering screen of our early television set. We would pass the large bag around, searching for the pieces with the darkest, most heavily coated edges. It is a beautiful metaphor for our lives back then. We took what was broken, rejected, and cheap, and we found the deep, rich flavor inside it together as a family. Do you recall the simple joy of water candy? It was a thick, entirely clear, heavy syrup that the vendor would serve on the ends of 2 small wooden sticks. It looked like liquid glass. The true joy of this cheap treat was not just eating it, but the physical ritual of preparing it. You had to work for your sweetness. We would hold a stick in each hand and begin to stretch the incredibly sticky syrup apart, twisting it and folding it back over itself repeatedly. As we pulled and kneaded the clear liquid, thousands of tiny air bubbles became trapped inside. Slowly, as if by magic, the clear syrup would turn opaque, transforming into a beautiful pearlescent white color. It became lighter and slightly airy. Only then would we finally lick the sweet, sticky mess from the wooden sticks. Our fingers would inevitably become a sticky disaster, but we did not care. The street storytellers, the kamishibai men, would often sell this candy to gather the children before starting their dramatic picture-board tales on the street corner. When the harsh winter winds blew through the cracks of the sliding wooden doors, and the family budget was stretched to its absolute limit, a hot bowl of noodles was our salvation. But we could not afford thick slices of pork or delicate tempura toppings. We ate what we called plain udon. It was a deep ceramic bowl filled with thick, chewy white wheat noodles, swimming in a steaming hot, clear broth made from kelp and a little soy sauce. The only topping was a small handful of chopped raw green onions. That was it. But when you were freezing cold, that bowl felt like a warm embrace. You would wrap your frozen hands completely around the hot ceramic, letting the heat seep into your skin. The steam would rise up, carrying the deep, comforting scent of the ocean from the kelp broth. We would slurp the thick noodles loudly, feeling the warmth travel all the way down into our empty stomachs. It taught us that true comfort does not come from expensive ingredients, but from the simple, profound contrast of warmth against the biting cold. A pot of Japanese curry was always considered a massive feast in our homes. The rich, spicy smell of the yellow curry powder would linger in the wooden house for days. However, real meat was so scarce that mothers had to be incredibly creative to fill the large pot. Our curries were stretched to the limit with massive chunks of cheap potatoes, large wedges of onion, and thick cuts of carrots. If there was any meat at all, it was cut into pieces so tiny you had to search carefully for them on your plate. Yet, pouring that thick, golden brown sauce over a mountain of white rice was the absolute highlight of our week. We ate until our bellies were completely full. But the absolute best part came the very next morning. The leftover curry, having sat in the cold kitchen overnight, would thicken and mature. The potatoes would begin to melt into the sauce, creating an incredibly rich, sweet flavor. Eating second-day curry for breakfast is a deep, cheap joy that connects every single person who grew up in that beautiful, frugal era. Let us talk about a snack that had a very mature flavor, yet was fiercely loved by children. It came in a very small, iconic red paper box. Inside were strips of dark, leathery kelp that had been heavily pickled in sweet vinegar. The moment you opened the box, a sharp, sour scent would immediately hit your nose. The strips were coated in a mysterious, fine white powder that was intensely flavorful. You could not eat it quickly. The kelp was extremely tough, requiring you to chew on a single small strip for a very long time. As you chewed, the sour vinegar and the deep, oceanic umami flavor would slowly release in your mouth. We would keep a single piece in our cheek for an entire afternoon while playing outside. It was a very cheap way to make a snack last for hours. Looking back, it is quite strange that small children enjoyed such an acidic, complex, and traditional flavor, but we adored it. It is a taste that immediately transports my mind back to the sunlit, dusty playgrounds of the 1970s. Finally, we come to a dish that perfectly encapsulates the soul of the Showa-era mother. In the terribly humid heat of the Japanese summer, a slice of cold, sweet watermelon was a rare and treasured treat. We would eat the crisp red flesh until we reached the hard green boundary. Today, people simply throw the rinds into the garbage. But back then, throwing away perfectly edible food was unimaginable. Our mothers would take those thick green rinds, carefully peel off the tough outer skin, and slice the pale white inner rind into thin pieces. She would then submerge them in a simple mixture of soy sauce, vinegar, or salty rice bran. By dinner time, those discarded scraps had miraculously transformed into delicious, crunchy pickles. They were salty, refreshing, and paired beautifully with plain rice. This simple act of pickling watermelon rinds was not just about saving money. It was a profound lesson in respect. It taught us to honor every single part of nature and to deeply appreciate the tireless, quiet love of the mothers who made sure we were fed. When we look back at the broken rice crackers, the sour plums, and the cheap fish sausages, we realize something incredibly important. We do not just miss the taste of these humble foods. We miss the feeling of being young, safe, and deeply connected to one another. We miss the warmth of the low wooden table, the sound of our mother working quietly in the cold kitchen, and the laughter of siblings sharing a single roasted sweet potato. The world today is filled with expensive delicacies and fast deliveries, but it somehow feels colder. The food we ate when we had absolutely no money was seasoned with gratitude, resilience, and a profound, unbreakable love. Thank you so much for walking down this nostalgic path with me today. If this journey brought a warm memory to your heart, please gently click the like button and subscribe to our channel for more walks through our beautiful past. Now, I want to ask you a very important question. What was the one cheap, humble meal your mother used to make that you secretly still crave today? Please open your heart and share your beautiful story in the comments below. Let us remember together.